All right, Brent Porcio, TopVelocity.net, 3x pitch BioMetric here of Nate from 3x Velocity Camp. We got him at 91. You can see Nate could continue to load more forward, good at loading down, but not keeping that forward momentum, which is key here. So I want to use the drawing tool, and we want to try to get the force vectors linear as we can. So this shin needs to come down here and get more linear, so moving more forward and down. You know, is that the reason this is happening? Is that because, oops, I was trying to clear that out. Is that because the hip mobility? If we look at this here, we can see this hip kind of getting stuck and starting to dip away from or towards the target. Is that because the hip is at end of range and abduction? So is that a mobility issue, not allowing that hip to keep moving forward and down at the same rate? So because of that, even though Nate's doing a good job of staying closed, load into the posterior chain well, when the front foot opens, the back leg just kind of turns over with a little push, but not really that dynamic. But Nate still keeps the trunk back, counter rotates the trunk really well, and gets good hip to shoulder separation. So he's doing the best he can. The question is that hip really preventing, making it hard for him to keep moving forward and down and get a more explosive back leg, because that force vector gets linear. When that force vector gets linear, now we can push, we can create some explosiveness, because it's putting the front leg in a position too where the hips are a little bit back and the trunk is wanting to shift forward already, and that puts the front leg force vector, the ankle knee, in a more vertical position, which makes it harder to be able to drive and move back. So at this point, if we look at, say, kinematic sequencing, we're looking to see how well we've got separation here positionally. How well is the sequencing separation? And we can see pretty good. The hips are peaking here, which is the red dot, the red line, which is good. But you can see the hips really start to take off, and then they just kind of, they slow down. This whole rotational movement of the hips is not really picking up speed, which tells me it was more rotational than it really was linear. I mean, we can probably can see that if we look at the linear kinematic sequencing, we can see the hips really at this point here where it's angularly rotating right here. So you can see on the left is the angular rotation. Where it's angularly peaking, it's just starting to move linear. Now it's moving linear. This is when it opens to the target, but it isn't really peaking. When the hips open, or when it gets up to its peak of angular, as it's moving forward, it kind of holds. So I think there is some good momentum there, but is there enough? You know, under 4 meters per second really isn't a lot of speed. But on the left side, you can see the hips are peaking here, and then the green is the trunk is peaking here. So there's a good distance of separation between the two. But notice when the trunk opens in rotation, it's really falling off in linear speed. So even though the trunk is really doing really well to push forward, it's interesting that it's declining in linear speed, which tells me it's more of it's being pushed out into that position. It's not really being catapulted out into that position. So I think Nate really understands where his body needs to go. It's just not as efficient and dynamic going there in some of these cases. You can also see here the blue on the left side. The blue is the glove side. That's pulling before the trunk. So is that pulling because of the hips are slowing down, which typically happens? The glove will help out. And then is that also because it's driving down? Is that what's helping pull the trunk forward? All things that would work, but kind of seen more as overcompensating and not doing it with an efficient kinetic chain. And because of that, we see the elbow here getting behind the back when the chest opens up. That would be called arm drag or hyperangulation. So a lot of these things, you know, with the glove pulling early, the linear speeds dropping off pretty aggressively as the trunk opens up. Is that why the arm is caught behind? Is that why we have we don't have an efficient kinetic chain at this point, and we have arm drag? So these are all important things. So it really goes down to that initial movement. Why did the hips stop moving forward down the same rate? Is that a hip mobility issue right here? And if it is a hip mobility issue, needs to work on that, and then we need to get more dynamic to the back leg and get the trunk catapulting and get those speeds accelerating up the kinetic chain. The other thing is, if we look at the chest orientation at front foot strike right here, the trunk is, from around 9 degrees of ipsilateral. I mean, it's leaning to the arm side. And you can see the hips are pushing really hard contralateral. So, and then only that, it throws an instability in the ankle. The front ankle now is in a valgus position. So we have a lot of instability here where the front ankles is valgus, the hips are pushing more contralateral, the trunk's pushing more ipsilateral. And then we also see as the trunk comes around, it goes to 35 degrees of contralateral tilt, which is way too aggressive. We don't want to go past 25. So there's a lot of left to right movement of the trunk. Even though we see all this good linear push in the trunk going forward, there's a lot of the left to right speeds or movements there. So it looks like even though the trunk's going forward, there's still a lot of rotational energy, and that's probably why that arm is dragging for so long, because there's a lot of rotational pulling, excessive pulling in the trunk, even though it's moving forward. And then last but not least is the front leg. The front leg isn't driving. It's holding stable, but it's not pushing and driving back, even though there's a good trunk orientation. So I think a lot of things are being forced here. I'd like to see the hip mobility clean up. I'd like to see the hip drive through in a more in a more ipsilateral position, so the trunk can get more contralateral. I think that'll create a more stable front leg. You're taking a lot of the pulling, the rotation out of it. And then ultimately, if those hips are up more, that front leg can kick back, and you see that trunk catapult forward and not being forced forward. I think a lot of the recommendations are to clean up the kinetic chain and make it more efficient. And a lot of that sounds like, well, this will be a lot of injury prevention, which it will. But at the end of the day, too, a lot of times when you relieve the stress at the end of the chain and you make things more efficient, that also creates a big performance boost in the process. But as far as like the performance things that aren't being used is like the front leg. It's not being used. So obviously we can get a lot of improvements out of that, or velocity out of that. Everything else is being used, but out of sync and not efficiently. And I think that's going to be the next performance boost, along with helping relieve a lot of the stress on the arm.